Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Holy Human Podcast. Here, we dive into nuanced conversations about the full spectrum human experience. This is a space devoted to those who live to bridge worlds. A space where the mystical and the mundane, the mind and the body, the masculine and the feminine, the holy and the human come together. My name is Felix Whitman, and I invite you to today's episode. Today I'm joined by Oliver Huntley, aka the Gnostic Druid on Instagram. Oliver is an amazing man, such an inspiration to me. Been wanting to interview him for quite a while now. He's really the man when it comes to all things early Christianity, Celtic Christianity. He hosts his own retreats in Wales and also in Glastonbury. So everyone who's interested in a pilgrimage over to these sacred sites, to these sacred lands, Oliver is the man to reach out to. He's also a scholar, studying the Bible in its ancient languages, especially Aramaic. And he's recently become a father as well. So yeah, he's just a great man, and it's just amazing to connect with men who are also rooted in Christ. Yeah. In this episode, we have been diving into the origins of the Bible. And Oliver has dedicated the last few years to really exploring the Aramaic roots and origins of the Bible and the different translations. We've also been exploring the development of early Christianity and the influence of the Roman Empire and how that in turn influences us nowadays. And much more, loads more topics that we've explored. So yeah, I'd say sit back, relax, and enjoy, my friends. Hi, Oliver. Welcome to the Holy Human Podcast.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. And even the name is just so beautiful. Feeling like, what does it mean to be holy human? And how do we understand that? How do we receive that? And how do we live from that? So thank you. I feel blessed, one, because I've always wanted to connect with you more deeply, but to be welcomed into this beautiful consecrated space, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Likewise, brother. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your lived experience and your wisdom. So yeah, I would love to start with the Bible, actually, something I've been becoming so interested and fascinated by, studying the Bible and really diving deep into the mystical meaning of the Bible. I use a very contemplative approach of studying the Bible, and I love your work as well, including the Aramaic language a lot. So that would be amazing as our first topic to explore, maybe let's start with the origins of the Bible and how the translations have actually developed over time. I think this might be super, super interesting and helpful for people also who are sort of finding the way to the Bible and who want to deepen their understanding and their own experience.
I love that. That's a great place to start. And there's something truly magical about the Bible because it almost feels like it's multidimensional in the sense that it can represent so many different things to so many different people and catalyze so many different experiences, if you will. Because not only is the Bible what feels like a beautiful symbol of unity and the transmission of the Holy Spirit, but it can also be a very divisive symbol and object that people can wield as much for division as it can be for unification. So it's an absolutely fascinating book. And for me, the Bible is always something that meets you where you are. And so it doesn't I feel like, bring anything new into your life. For me, the Bible is something that helps reveal what is already inside us, and it helps us on that journey of getting to know ourselves. And so anytime, something is written down with spirituality, when people read it, it's always open into interpretation. It really challenges us, tests us, and refines us in our ability to receive wisdom, as any good book will, whether it's religious or anything else for that matter. But I think the Bible is really important to explore, because a lot of my work is doing translations both in the ancient Aramaic and Greek, and in my own way trying to connect with the more authentic words of Jesus. I don't think anyone can say the true words of Jesus, because that you can't really get to, the quote unquote factual truth of these words. It's how do we align ourselves with perhaps the more authentic transmissions of what these great teachers were really saying. And so there's a lot of different avenues or layers that you can take the Bible, peeling back layer by layer, and really in many ways going back in time, right? So from age to age. And so you can deepen more and more to the Bible as you get perhaps, more into the original or ancient languages that the Bible was written in, because I think that's one of the interesting misconceptions a lot of people have. And especially if you don't know a lot about history and ancient history, some people just assume Jesus spoke English, right? That's kind of, or whatever your native language is, wherever you are in the modern world, your modern local language. We sometimes create in our mind like, oh yeah, Jesus was speaking this language. But then when you go back in history, you realize is that the Bible itself has been translated many times. And there's all sorts of interesting things that happen when words get translated, just like when we play a game of telephone, right? When we say one thing to someone, then they say that to another person, they say that to another person. It unfortunately changes over time. And so we see that also within the Bible, even in the aspect that much of the Bible, or the words that were recorded and attributed to certain disciples or Jesus or other figures, many of these things were not actually written down and compiled into a book until centuries later, sometimes even. And so you have even gaps of time from the original words even being written down and recorded. So there's a beautiful space that I feel opens up when we encounter the Bible, where it is still a beautiful transmission of light and wisdom, no matter what Bible you encounter, what language. But there's ways of going through the Bible, I feel like, that you can then access really beautiful transmissions that, in my opinion, are more authentic to the words that Yeshua and these holy men and women spoke. And even when you take the kind of modern day Bible, the King James, for example, and there's many, many, many Bibles, even when you read the words today, as you find them today, written in, the modern languages and vernacular, you still receive such an incredible transmission of wisdom, right? It
Yeah.
really is something that is so timeless. And I give it such appreciation and awe of like, wow, even today, with the Bible that we have today, which we'll talk about soon, is very different than maybe, older forms of the Bible or older words, is still such a beautiful transmission of wisdom. It's just a little bit more difficult, I find, in today's world to find the same level of wisdom that you would find with older versions of the Bible, but you still can receive so, so, so much. And when I work with the Bible, even the kind of modern day Bible, in my work, I encounter a lot of people who are in various stages of religious observance when it comes to Christianity. And many people who consider themselves Christian consider the Bible, the absolute law, right, of all that is. And so
Yeah.
if it's written in the Bible, it's true. And if it's not in the Bible, it's not true. And so this is
Yeah.
where you start to see division take place within people who
Mm-hmm.
wield the Bible in this way, where they say like, it's this way because the Bible says so, or it can't be that way because the Bible doesn't say so. And it's really beautiful to actually talk with these people and work with these people and then help open new doorways for them, because it's not about changing their belief systems when we analyze different layers of the Bible. It's about helping them get more out of the book that they love so much by opening up more ancient forms of it, or really ancient languages that it was written in before it was ever in the modern day version. And so that's why when people say, well, it's not true because it's not in the Bible, or it's true. And I'm like, I always kind of come back and ask them, just questions, right? It's not about arguing with anyone, because you can't change anyone's mind with an argument anyways. how you change people's mind is with a good story and helping people explore nuance and depth of things that they already believe. And so you just ask questions and you ask me like, well, what Bible are you talking about? Or what version of the Bible? Or what language are you talking about? And it kind of catches people off guard a little bit because they're like, what are you talking about? Hasn't the Bible just been the same forever? And that's where you start to see the cracks open up and new light can pour through those cracks, because you're like, oh, so there's more to the Bible, or there has been more to the Bible, and the Bible has been changed over time, right? Whether it's by intentional intent or simply mistranslations. And then when you start to allow some malleability in people's relationship to the Bible, all sorts of beautiful things will open. And so that's why you start to take people, you just walk with them. You're like, well, let's explore this. Like, you really like this verse or this passage or this word in the modern day Bible. Why don't we look at that? Like, let's explore what that might mean in ancient Greek, or let's explore what that might mean in ancient Aramaic. And then you start to see there's such space where people can not change anything about their relationship to the Bible, just deepen their relationship to the Bible and start to receive more of the words that they've cherished so much. Suddenly they're like, wow, I didn't know it also meant this, or could mean this, or I didn't realize that this being added to the Bible or this part being taken away from the original Bible changes the story significantly. And so it's about helping people remain open and humble and then get to deepen that connection. And that's one of the things that I always, whether it's teaching about this or that, I always like to open spaces up by reminding people of a very specific Aramaic word that Jesus would speak, especially when he would engage in different healing work. He would always say the Aramaic word eighth batak. And how you can translate that is it either means to open, but really the way it was used means to be opened. Right. And so it's interesting. Why would he say that before he would perform his healings, which really wasn't him healing? It was the Holy Father coming through and healing. He would remind people, be open, right? Because if we're fixed, if we're firm, right? If our cup is already full, we can't receive anything. We can't fill ourselves anymore with the Holy Spirit. So it's about making sure we return to that humility of openness and allowing more space in our being to be filled with the light of God. And so I think that's why going back in time with the Bible is so therapeutic on a spiritual level for people, because it reminds us, wow, I think I know this, but what if there's more? What if there's more ways in which God wants to speak to me? And then you can just be open to receive more. And so that's why I think the Bible is such a beautiful book, because it meets everyone where they are. And then it also gives you the opportunity to meet it deeper and really go back in time to like, okay, what were some of these things that were said in Greek, in Aramaic, and do they mean the same thing that we read today, or is there something drastically different in there? And in many cases, it's drastically different. And so, yeah, cracks people open in a beautiful way. And the end result is the same. They still have the relationship with God, but they have a deeper appreciation for the Bible and what the Bible holds.
Oh, thank you so much for opening this up, and the way you shared was so beautiful. I particularly loved how you're all about deepening instead of changing someone's belief system. Or like, we're not changing anything. We're just deepening in that which is already present within us. So I really loved that. There's a couple of things that I want to bring here. Like, first, I'm such a fan of Latin. So that's just one language back, right? So the latest version is the modern languages like English, French, German, Spanish, etc. One layer back, if you peel it like one layer back, you end up with Latin. And, me personally, I had Latin. I studied it in school for like 7 years. So I'm very familiar with the language and the power of that language. And I had a conversation with a friend recently, and she said, which I really loved, every language has a particular soul, right? And so Latin, much like German as well, has a soul in the sense that it cuts right through all the bullshit. Like, it's very precise, and because it's an ancient language and it's no longer alive and being constantly changed, and there's no longer this field of like with the modern languages. Like, if I look at German, it's constantly changing at the moment, but Latin is almost like it's very rooted. So when I read the Bible in Latin, or what I love to do is like praying the rosary in Latin, there's something happening inside of me that is just it's almost like I'm dropping a layer deeper, and I can feel how the prayers are rooting me in a tradition, in a field that is stabilizing me because it's been there for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So that's fascinating to me, exploring languages in this sense. And then what I also want to dive into with you is the soul of different languages. And I know you studied a lot of the Aramaic language. So I recently read not the whole book, but a few pages of the Secret Teachings of Jesus by Lars Moore, like the Law of Light, I think it's called. Maybe you know it.
Mm-hmm, I do.
And yeah, I thought so. And in that book, he describes the beauty of the Aramaic language being very feminine. So I would love for you to dive into the whole Aramaic language and the heart of why it is actually so special and how it is different from the modern languages.
Of course. And I love that you spent so much time with Latin. Like for me, when I was in school, classics was always an important
Yeah,
idea,
yeah.
and getting to explore that, and especially the Roman civilization in general has always been
Oh yeah,
extremely
yeah,
fascinating to me.
yeah.
And for many reasons, I know we don't have, that we might not dive into that, but I really love that you enjoy reading the Bible in Latin, because you're right. When things are fixed in certain cultural lenses or languages, you actually get a different flavor, right? You get a different flavor. Like it's all ice cream, but it's a different flavor of ice cream. You're still eating ice cream, but you
It's a
get a
lovely
different
analogy.
nuanced texture of it.
Yeah.
And there's power in Latin. And I always used to laugh, when in school, when I was also studying Latin, because when we see Latin, usually in kind of modern culture, movies or media, it was always kind of like connected to the spiritual realm. Like when people were like trying to like banish demons or do exorcisms or something, they were like speaking in Latin, which is funny. Or when like demons would be speaking in these movies, they would speak Latin for some reason. I was like, why? Like
Yeah,
why is there such this like mystical spiritual
yeah.
connection to Latin? And I think some of it was
Harry
probably
Potter.
superficial. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but Harry
No problem.
Potter, all the spells are in Latin, right?
Yeah.
So that's super interesting.
Yeah. So like why? Like that's the big, obviously we can't answer that for sure, but I think there's a superficial aspect that it's an ancient language. So I think modern day people just assume ancient languages are magical from one way. But also I think any really fixed ancient language that survived and become widespread, as you were saying, like it carries a really important transmission coding to it. And I think Latin could be considered in the exact same way that it's not just a surface level language. There is mystical roots to it, even in the sounds and the way, the linguistics of it. So I think that there is power in there. And so I love that you've chosen to also explore the Bible in Latin, because again, it's going to help you expand your connection to these words and get different reference points. And that's why, as we kind of start talking about Aramaic, especially with biblical Aramaic, that's the important point, that it's hard as we go back in time to different languages, and especially if we explore like the Roman culture, which is still very mysterious, right? We don't really know a tremendous amount about Roman culture because so much of the records have been destroyed. So what we do know about it, there's a lot of speculation and there's a lot of assumptions that comes into it. And also perhaps in the same way with Latin, because it's not a living language in the same way that we see languages today. As you go back in time, what's important to build up our worldview or our models of the world, and especially our spiritual understandings of ancient traditions, is you need many data points or reference points. And the more reference or data points you have, the more you're creating an accurate model or an accurate perception or perspective on certain things. And so what I mean by that is, when we think about what are the words of Jesus, you can just read the modern day Bible and be like, okay, well, is that an authentic account of these words? But if you start adding in other languages, whether it's Latin, Greek, Aramaic, even forms of kind of old Romance, and Old English, what you're doing is you're giving yourself more data points to analyze,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's refining your perspective on something, or expanding your ability to see the truth in the words. Because if you're reading something in Latin and then in Greek and then in Aramaic, they're all going to say something different, but you'll start to see the golden thread that weaves through these words and be like, oh, they all kind of reference this idea or this specific person or this place or something like that. And then you can be like, oh, well, if they're all saying something around this idea or this topic or this transmission, then you can put more weight that that's true or that's accurate. And so that's why I think it's important for those of us who are really interested in the Bible and the words of these great men and women is add more data points. And one easy way to do that is by reading and receiving from different languages or different versions of the Bible throughout different ages. And whether you can read, Latin or Greek or Aramaic, there are many people out there who have done incredible translation work, true
Oh yeah.
scholars and linguists. And so you don't have to take everything that someone says as true, but the more you receive from different people who are working on these things, again, the more you're going to expand and refine your perspective. And so that's why I was so curious in the beginning of my journey into Aramaic. I was like, I kind of want to know what was written before the English version of the Bible, because I was always both intrigued by the Bible and also kind of repelled by the Bible, because some of the things that I read in the Bible will really move me in modern day English, and other things don't make sense, right? And you're like, well, what are they actually saying here, and why is this important? And then even when we look at the Bible, most people think the Bible is just one book and it's cohesive and it's coherent and all parts agree. But that's actually not the case, because the modern day Bible, the canon Bible, as it's called, is kind of broken up into 4 books or 4 gospels. And not even the gospels agree on every point, which is very
Right.
interesting. Few people realize that, right? The gospels are just accounts of something, of history or words, and they don't always agree on things. And so if you read different books, you'll get different perspectives. So it's really already inviting us into more an analysis and a synthesis of certain things. And so going back into Aramaic, I was like, this is a way for me to get back as close to the source as I can. And that's usually what you want, whether you're a historian or a linguist or anyone exploring an idea or topic from the ancient world. You want to get as close to the source as you can, because that's more pure, if you will, or there's less space for corruption or degradation of wisdom or information, anything like that. You're getting really close. And so when I looked it up, I'm like, well, what is the language that even Jesus would speak in, or any of these people at the time, the Essenes or whatnot? I didn't even know. I was like, was it Hebrew? Oh, it's Aramaic. And so it really opened the story of like, what is Aramaic? Like, I didn't even realize Aramaic was different from Hebrew, because doesn't it use the same alphabet? So how can you have
Yeah.
like a different, using the same letters, but you get different end results? And so it was a really confusing and mysterious world for me to step into. And I was absolutely blown away, because before I studied with some of my teachers to develop my own ability to translate, right, these Hebraic roots, letters, and words in Aramaic, I wanted to receive from really beautiful teachers or people who had really created a level of excellence and accuracy. And so I would just read different authors like Neil Douglas Klotz, Dale Allen Hoffman, these people,
Just
really beautiful. Yeah, there you go. Right. So there's so much there that you can receive. And what you realize very quickly is that because Aramaic is such an ancient language, and it's still, there's even different forms of Aramaic, and there's still a lot of question marks around the words and the language itself. You come to the conclusion really quickly that no one actually can say for sure. Like, that's something that's really fun and also frustrating about Aramaic, is there's no authoritative source on what's 100% true or accurate when it comes to Aramaic. So everyone creates their perspective on it, or their lensing on it, and their understanding and interpretation of it. And because there's not one central authority to it, it allows really beautiful personal experiences with our own interpretations, our own ways of working with it. And so that's why I love going into Aramaic. One is because it's far from settled, and there's still a lot of room for us to receive the words that feel in alignment to us. And it brings us, at least it gives us a framework to start to explore these words by these great men and women as close, right, as contemporary to the source as possible. And that's what you find in Aramaic. And then as you dive into it, you're like, wow, how did these translations and these understandings, how did they not make it into the Bible that we have today? Because it would be a fully different story. I don't want to say fully different story, but there would be a lot of important changes in how the Bible was written today if we were to go back and translate it as accurately as we can. from the Aramaic. And so you're going to get a new relationship to the teachings of Jesus. And I think that to me is the greatest gift that Aramaic gives to people, is it gives you a new relationship to what the teachings mean, and what they can mean for you, what they can mean for all of us on a very individual level. And that's unfortunately what happened a lot with, as Rome kind of took over, as Rome kind of started claiming Christianity to be its own, and
Yeah.
using and transforming the empire into a Christian empire, many things were changed within the words that were recorded and continued to be passed down. And the Bible is kind of formulated in the way that we see it today. But before kind of Rome did its interesting changes, and if you want to talk, we can talk about what Rome did to Christianity that maybe was different from the original teachings later in this
Yeah. Yeah.
transmission. But it was incredible to see what was left out, and what the things that weren't included, right, intentionally. So we can get into like conspiracies of like, how did they change Christianity to suit their needs, which they absolutely did, and there are many unfortunate ways that they did this. But one of the biggest problems that you find, that I think it was just a problem of translation, where when you go from Aramaic, and the first kind of jump that you would have seen would have gone from Aramaic to Greek, and then from Greek
Yeah.
to Latin. When you're translating words in Aramaic, they're in many ways like hieroglyphics. And what I mean by that is there's beautiful ways in which you can open up Aramaic words, and you can then start to move through the landscape of the words, where not only do the words mean something, especially if they're engendered masculine or feminine, but then the roots, the Hebrew roots that you find within the Aramaic words will mean something. And then the individual letters will mean something. The individual Hebrew letters will change the context of the word depending on how the letters are formulated too. So there's such a nuanced depth to every Aramaic word, to the roots, to the letters. And it makes it very hard to translate one Aramaic word into one Greek word, right? Because Greek is not
Yeah.
structured
Yeah.
in the same way that Aramaic is structured. So they think, oh, this Aramaic word must mean this word in Greek. But you've already lost so much of the depth and the nuance just trying to make it a one-to-one translation. And then going from Greek, which is, in my opinion, slightly or very differently, drastically, linguistically than Latin, you're again losing some of that core of light, right? Or core of transmission in these words. And then so you're just whittling it down, or hollowing it out, maybe is a better word, in order to translate it from something that's so formless and something that's so more alive in spirit into languages that are much more formalized and structured, a little bit more masculine, brain oriented. And so you're losing this incredible wealth of depth in the teachings. And so, yes, I'm sure there was intentional corruption. Again, we can talk about that later if you want. But so much of it was the problem of trying to translate the mystical, spiritual side of Aramaic into languages like Greek, and especially doing it on a one-to-one, like this word to this word. You can't do that. Or at least you can't do that all the time. And when you're doing it 2 or 3 times, you're already right there, hollowing out and whittling away so much of the depth. And that is why I really encourage people to start exploring, at least go to ancient Greek, but really go into the Aramaic and just start immersing yourself in translations of whether it's the Lord's Prayer or the Beatitudes or the Bible itself. Just look
Yeah.
at that and you'll
Yeah.
see, like, wow, I didn't know that was there. I didn't know that's what was said, or these were the meanings attached to these words, and I had no idea it was even there. So there's such this beautiful windows that can open up for people if you do go back in
Yeah.
time.
Oh, so much that you just open up here. I'm loving this conversation. So what I'm hearing is there's basically 2 dimensions that we are talking about. So one dimension is there is meaning getting lost through translation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other dimension is there is meaning that has been lost because of corruption, because of
Yes. Oh,
distortion
for
that were
sure.
put in intentionally. So we have 2 dimensions, 2 layers to add, like in our understanding. We have the original, like the closest to the source, like the words of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
then the how they were written down and orally conveyed and then written down, and then we have the language barrier and the distortion. So I really want to highlight that for people listening right now. So
Absolutely. I
this
might even
is,
add a third dimension too, our ability to receive them vibrationally, like the words vibrationally. So
oh
you add that
wow,
into a dimension too, because
yeah,
Aramaic is a seed language like Sanskrit, for example. And Sanskrit's a
mm-hmm.
beautiful way for a lot of people to get introduced to the vibrational power of ancient languages. Because like most people, when they go to a yoga class, at the end they might like chant or say a Sanskrit mantra. And most of the time, people have no idea what's being spoken, but you feel it, right? You'll be like, I don't actually have no idea what these people are chanting, but vibrationally, you're like, whoa, there's vibrational transmissions that come
Yeah,
from these words. And Aramaic is the same way, where there's vibrational transmissions, just the way the words vibrate as they come out. That's another dimension. That's also our ability to recognize and feel that's lost. So that's definitely a factor too.
oh yeah, oh thanks for adding this one. And to really break this down to a very basic understanding, this is not like super esoteric. It's more like, have you ever read a book, like the Bible, for example, some kind of spiritual knowledge? You read it maybe 5 years ago, right? And then you read the same text now. There's a whole different understanding that you have because
Yeah.
you changed, your energy, like your bioenergetic field recalibrates as you live, like naturally, organically. It's just happening. So as you come across the same text, for me, for example, I've been studying Meister Eckhart for quite a while, and every time I read his sermons or any quotes or something of his wisdom, it changes. Like there's a friend of mine calls it the spiralic way, the spiral path. It's like as you come across something, it changes because you change, and it's like a
Mhm.
spiral way, a spiral path. You come across the same essence, vibrationally speaking, but you see it from a different lens. And this also ties it back to what you were saying earlier. It's like as we study different languages, it's not it's almost like we're mapping out the internal truth that's already there. That the
Mhm.
truth is living. The origin is within us. Christ lives
Yes.
within us. And through like, thinking about it, working with it, studying it, sitting with it, contemplating it, we are creating this internal map where every time we discover something new, we're coming one step closer to the truth. Yeah.
Mhm. I love that.
Oh,
Well said. Well said. I studied and went to school at a Vedic school, funny enough, during my university years for one of my
wow.
graduate programs. And they said something that I always think about is in the kind of Vedic tradition, especially as you're working with the Vedas and exploring that type of way of encoding languages, they always say knowledge is structured in consciousness, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you're saying is that your how you view the world and how you encounter wisdom and knowledge is always filtered through who you are at that time. And as you grow and refine, or maybe as you de-evolve and close down more, either way you'd go, but whoever you become later on, then that's how you receive the same wisdom and knowledge. And so a lot of people who are on the spiritual path, as we are, as we go year to year, we're growing, we're evolving, right? Our path on the spiral is getting higher and higher. We will encounter the same words, the same transmission, but they'll mean something different, right? We'll understand it in deeper ways, more nuanced ways. And so that's many of the teachers of Aramaic will say this, but also how the language itself is structured, even the way Jesus, I feel like, speaks about his words being like living waters. It's like we will grow with Aramaic and Aramaic will grow with us. And so the same word will be spoken in Aramaic one day and how we receive it, but it might mean something so much more and deeper as we grow in age and mature in life. And so even though
Yeah.
Aramaic is very much a dead language, right? It's not really spoken in the way that it was, back then or widespread. It's still very much a living language because it's living with and through us. And I think that's the
Mm.
important part is that, again, that openness, constantly returning to that humility and openness is like what we know is what we know now, but that doesn't mean it's the sum total of everything. And we have to allow ourselves that journey of re-meeting our belief systems, our spiritual connections, and really the words and the teachings that we put so much value in, we have to keep meeting them again and again, because they will change. Any teaching that doesn't change or grow, I feel is not fixed or aligned with the natural laws of creation. And so it needs to move with us. It needs to dance with us. It needs to live and breathe with us. As, coincidentally enough, so much of the teachings in originally Christianity have to do with, the breath and the movements, and making sure things are breathing new life always into us.
Oh, I love that. I would love to dive into that later on. What I'm feeling right now is bringing back up we had three pillars of how, meaning gets lost. So we had the translation, the distortion put in externally. Then you named the vibrational, state that we are in, so we can receive things. And that goes also hand in hand with something that just came to me, is the culture we are living in. The Bible was written in a certain culture, and that is very different from the culture we are living in right now. So we can't take everything super literal. I've been reading Teresa of Avila, one of the Spanish Christian mystics from the 16th century. And you can't just take everything literal. Like when St. Paul, for example, writes about his suffering, where he writes about what he had to endure. He calls it boasting. Like, he doesn't want to boast, but for the sake of the Lord, he has to boast. That doesn't make sense to apply to our life at the moment. For us in our Western culture, right? He was imprisoned. He didn't have any food. He was tortured, all of that. That doesn't happen collectively in the Western world at the moment. Like, no one gets tortured. No one gets, no one starves. So we can't just literally say, like, okay, he teaches us this is good, and so we need to also starve and, deprive us of sleep and whatever he experienced, right? So we need to put that into the cultural, societal background as well, a context rather.
Exactly. That's important. Yeah.
Yeah. And then from here, I would love, I just wanted to add this, but from here, I would love to dive into sort of, we explored a bit of the Aramaic, and let's explore what happened in Rome. Why did why is so much lost as, things happened to develop in Rome? I'd love with you to dive into this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey of how Rome became a Christian nation or Christian empire, because it's also, again, one of those historical accounts that's far from settled. There's different theories and there's different ideas, but we don't ultimately know exactly why Rome decided to become Christian. And there's, I'll talk about what I kind of feel as true, but again, it's for everyone to decide. But few people forget, or a few people know, or should I say remember, that Rome was the biggest persecutor of Christians in the first few centuries. Like, one of the biggest kind of genocides that ever take place was the millions and millions and millions of Christians that were killed by Rome in the first few centuries before Rome became Christian. So that's why it's interesting for people to realize the history of Christianity, because most people think, oh, it's just the Pope, it's Rome, that's it, that's the foundations. But there was such an important time period after the crucifixion and the foundations of Christianity, where Christianity flourished for centuries before Rome had anything positive to do with Christianity. And whether it was ever positive, that's for us to debate. But there is an entire kind of history of Christianity before Rome kind of got its hands on it. Now, if you want to talk about that history, it's something that's so near and dear to my life and my work, but kind of zeroing in on that moment that Rome became a Christian nation. Well, at the time, especially when we look at around Constantine and what Rome was kind of looking at, it was a very tumultuous time. Like, it was a very, very chaotic time for the Roman Empire, where there was division, right? There wasn't clear leadership or one emperor put into place. And so what you find at the time is the Roman Empire was becoming very fragmented, fractured, and weak politically and in a culture or society. And then you had a lot of what was named, kind of like the barbarians and all these savages around, these tribal people. And they weren't tribal people, just how Rome kind of slighted them and insulted them. But they found that a lot of these kind of barbarian nations and civilizations that were around Rome that were starting to attack the borders of Rome and destabilize it further. It was very difficult for Rome at the time to defend itself against all these attacks. Yet one thing seemed to be very present in all these kind of cultures and tribes that were around Rome, is they were all becoming Christian very quickly, right, at that time. And so a decision was made, and again, we don't know exactly why, but the decision was made essentially to bring Christianity into the fold within the Roman Empire. And so the historical accounts and the writings that I find to be true is that essentially they found Christianity could unite kind of all the tribes and the invading forces around Rome far better than the sword could. So it's like, if you realize is that this force of Christianity is spreading around the world, if you become a central agent to that force, you can pacify a lot of the chaos and the warring that was going around, and the skirmishes that were happening at the border of the Roman Empire. And so I think it was very much a political move to gain a certain leverage or power, especially with this chaotic time. And so this was a time when they're like, all right, let's accept Christianity into the empire and let's become one of the central points of this growing faith. And then what happened was then Rome became this symbol of Christianity, and essentially then they became the controlling agent in all other cultures that were also considering themselves Christian or becoming Christianized. So it's a very smart move, right? Again, if that was the main reason why they became Christian, we can speculate on that. But that was the end result, is that becoming Christian, they created peace in the Roman Empire, as well as creating a certain foothold of power by spiritually dominating and controlling other Christian nations and cultures. So it was a very smart move. It was a very lucrative move, and it was a very advantageous move politically for Rome to become Christian. Now, I don't think that's the sum total of the story. I think Emperor Constantine has a really interesting and beautiful story in his relationship to how he found the Christed teachings, the Christed light, the symbols that he chose, right? There's an entire history there that would probably take many podcasts to start to explore. But what I find very interesting is that as Rome became Christian, what they needed to do essentially was unify Christianity, because up until Rome became kind of a central point in the Christian story, Christianity was very diverse, right? There was many cultures that were considered Christian, and none of the traditions and none of the teachings were unified, right? Everything was sort of different. Everything had a different flavor. And so it was important for Rome to kind of organize and create a framework that all Christianity then could function and move and flow through that framework. And part of that organization that Rome wanted to go through was to create a unification of the teachings, namely the Bible or the Gospels that would then be used in the central Bible. And so they had different meetings, and they were essentially called councils, right? The council meeting. And most people are familiar with some of the more famous ones, like the Council of Nicaea. But what they did is they essentially gathered many of the Christian leaders from around the world to essentially discuss, how do they think they should formalize this growing faith? How do they think they should organize this growing faith? And how do they create unity in the stories that are told and in the teachings and the rituals and the traditions of it? And this is where we see what became known as the canon Bible really start to take shape, because they chose the 4 books that we see in the canon Gospels, or the canon Bible today. But what few people realize is so what we know now is there's over 150 other Gospels, right? Or there's another 146 Gospels, right? And so you have the 4 that are added into that. And that's just what we know now. So imagine how many Gospels didn't survive throughout time, and how many Gospels have yet to be discovered as well. And Gospels are just like accounts, right? They're just perspectives on what happened. And so there's an incredible plethora of other Gospels and religious accounts of the story of Christianity, and they get considered into the topic. They're called apocryphal, right? The Apocrypha, or the apocryphal Gospels. So these are the Gospels that didn't make the cut into the Romanized Bible that we unfortunately still have today. But there's all these different accounts, and it's such a tragedy because not only do the 4 books that Rome chose, they don't always agree on everything. Imagine what the other gospels said and what the other gospels transmitted, and what we could have gleaned and learned from the other gospels, many of which we do still have access today, and you can read them, like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary. There's some beautiful, beautiful other gospels that aren't in the Bible. And you get to realize, like, wow, what else is out there? And so I am grateful in some ways that Rome formalized things and created a coherence around things, even though there's a lot of tragedy that took place because of that. And we're still kind of recovering from that and still experiencing a lot of trauma from that. But there is beauty in sometimes formalizing something and organizing something. But that is where we start to see Christianity very specifically changed its flow, or changed how we would then relate to God through the Romanized church. Because one of the things that was present, and again, if you want to explore this idea more, we can, but up until Rome kind of really kind of took charge of how Christianity was going to flow in through the centuries, the teachings of Jesus and many of the early teachings of Christianity, long before it was ever called Christianity, was about your heart to God, right? It's all about your heart's connection to God, and nothing is between that. There's nothing that stands between you and God. It's your divine sovereign connection to Allah, to all that is, to the sense of our divine creator. And so what Rome did by establishing and formalizing Christianity is then they created an intermediary, or really like a middleman, if you will, between your heart and God. And so you would then have to find your salvation, not as your own sovereign right to the divine, but you would have to then go through the clergy and the church in order for you to have salvation, for the salvation of your soul. And so they really took your power away, your divine power away, your divine connection away. And it was a playbook that almost every ancient culture would go through at some point. I mean, even the Amun priesthood in Egypt was a great example. So they kind of took a playbook out of that. It's that if you realize you can take someone's ability to be their soul, the salvation of their soul, if you can put something as conditions into that, like you have to give power to the clergy, to the church, or you have to give them money, especially, you're taking people's power away, and you're making people dependent on a religious institution for the salvation of their soul. So Rome did 2 big things, right? They codified and changed and whittled down many of the teachings that we see, but they also changed the whole dynamic of how our soul can be saved, which is through them, when that was never the case. And we don't see that, or we get the exact opposite of that when we read the Aramaic words of Jesus.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm just sitting here in awe at your wisdom and all the study that you've put in. It's so rich. So I'd love to dive deeper into what happened before Rome. You were hinting on it. The early Christian church fathers. How did they? You were saying they related directly from their heart to God. To Allah, as you were saying.
Yeah,
So
Allah is the Aramaic word for God. If anyone listening wants to know, Allah is the word for God. Yeah, I mean, that is the beautiful story of what I call the church before the church, or as it was called in the ancient days, the mother church, right? And so this is something that was always a thorn in the side of the Roman church. Is Rome always wanted to be the best and the most powerful, and in many ways they wanted to consider themselves the first church, but they weren't the first church. And they would argue that for centuries and even declare war, right, against the mother church, which was the origin story of what was known as the Celtic church, or the ancient church of Britain. And people are like, well, why? Like, that makes no sense. You're telling me there was an old church in England or something like that? How could that possibly be? And that's one of the forgotten stories that, I've dedicated my life to telling, because not only is it such an important story, but it also tells the story of what I consider one of the most important figures in the Christian story, which is Joseph of Arimathea. Right? And he is a man that's only casually and briefly mentioned in the Bible, but really he is the most unsung hero of the whole biblical epic before the time of Jesus, during Jesus' life, and most importantly, after Jesus' crucifixion, because the whole propagation and the continuation of the Christed light really was in his hands, or through his grace and his protection and his life's work allowed Christianity to root itself and to flourish long before it was ever Christianity, in the purest form of the faith. And this story really begins after the crucifixion and after the resurrection. And if you go back in those times, I mean, it's such a beautiful and also very scary and chaotic time, but it's such an important time because once the figurehead of Yeshua, of Jesus, once he was crucified and resurrected, now what we have is the start of a very important story, which is really the story of the Grail, or the story of Mary Magdalene, or all the things that get connected to the Magdalene, to the Grail, and to the light that was then brought away from the Holy Land. And so the story of Joseph comes into focus and into picture, because it was through Joseph and his connections, his wealth, his power, his influence, that allowed him to make sure the Holy Family was safe. Many of the disciples were safe. Mary Magdalene was safe. The Grail was safe. The teachings were safe. And so the story goes is that after the crucifixion, the resurrection, when all of these important biblical figures were being hunted and killed and murdered and locked up in prison, tortured, it was very important to make sure that these key figures were rescued and brought away into safety. And so this is the story of how Joseph and a number of disciples and the Holy Family left with him on a boat, and their first stop was into France, and from France they went to ancient Britain. And so the oldest church in the world is actually in ancient Britain. And again, that's such an interesting fact for people to try and comprehend, because very few people know that. And even few people continue to talk about that. So it's one of those, aspects of Christianity that I think is going to come to light more and more as we go through the years. But this Christianity, again, long before it was ever considered Christianity, this seed of light was then planted in ancient Albion, which was the name for ancient Britain at the time. And it flourished there for centuries. And why this form of faith was so important, because not only was it about the teachings of the Logos, or the masculine form of the Christ, which Jesus, Yeshua, represented, but it also had to do with the feminine form of Christ, the Sophionic Christ, the Christed light that Mary Magdalene and the many important women afterward also anchored within their hearts and their womb spaces. And so when you get into the purest form of Christianity, the Christed light is one beam of light that then breaks into two streams. One is the masculine light, and one is the feminine light, or the Logos and the Sophia. And so to the early forms of Christianity, you can never actually understand the Christed light or receive the full total of the Christed radiance unless you are able to receive both those streams, the Sophionic and the Logos stream, or the teachings of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene's a big topic. We're not going to have time to go into her today. But what she held, what she represented, not only was just as important as the teachings that Jesus held, she survived, right? Or she survived in her fully humanized form and continued to teach after the crucifixion and the resurrection of Yeshua. And her teachings became fundamental in anchoring this ancient church in the lands of ancient Britain. And so when this religion flourished for centuries, this is what essentially pissed Rome off, for lack of a better term. And Rome actually started declaring war after the 4th and 5th centuries against the British church, because they themselves had to admit that the British church came first. It was known as the prime church, right? Or the church that had its, and when I say dominance, I don't mean in a form of control, but it was the one in charge. So if the British church wanted to, and it never wanted to, it could have controlled even Rome, or it should have had the spiritual authority of Rome, but it didn't want that. It essentially said, just if you want to do your thing, you do your thing, but leave us alone. But if it wanted to, it could have been in control of all the Christian centers around the world. And so this is why Rome was so angry at the British church and did everything they could, even backing different invaders like the Saxons, to take over that church. And so this is why this form of faith is so beautifully important, because again, it's the light of the Father, which Jesus represents, the Logos, but also the light of the earth and the mother, or the feminine. And so you bring that together. That was the full total of the Christed teachings. And this is one of the things that Rome left out as it changed Christianity, is it got away, or did away with, the feminine light and the feminine teachings and the importance of the feminine Christ. Right. And all the women that held these feminine teachings, it did away with them. It in many ways deleted them, which was so unfortunate, because up until that point, women not only held such an important role in the story of Christianity. If you go back to the first century, it was actually through the women and the first saints. Because of them, that's what allowed the light to spread and propagate, and they were the ones to initiate, what would become the most luminous figures in Christian history were initiated by these Christed women, the women who embodied the Sophionic light of Christ. And it's such a shame that these women and the feminine teachings had to be erased in that way, and corrupted in that way, and destroyed, through violence and murder in many ways. Not good ways. But it's interesting because it's starting to come back now. And so I see there's like the resurrection or the second coming, and we all get to decide what the second coming of Christ represents to us. But I think there's this big resurgence of these feminine teachings, and really this deep soul-seated memory of a church, right? Long before it was ever called a church, but a form of church that held both these teachings. And that's what was here in ancient Britain. That's what was anchored and woven into these lands for centuries before Rome ever showed up on the scene as a Christian authority.
Wow. There's a lot to sit with.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, it's sometimes hard for me to like condense it all down quickly into.
I love it. I love it, Oliver. It's just, yeah. Oh my God. So first and foremost, my personal experience here. I've been, traveling to Ireland and Scotland and the UK the last few years, and I've been really feeling drawn to these particular islands. So there is something there, that I could never really put into words, but I still followed the call, and there's something on a very deep cellular level that's happening there. So I can definitely, just feel what you're saying, that the feminine wisdom coming alive and being very alive on these islands. For people who are more skeptical, I just want to throw this in as well, because it's a lot. It's a big stretch. You're now all of a sudden you're saying Mary Magdalene went to England and founded there the original church. So just where do you get that information from? Like just inviting people into your perspective. That's what I want to open up here.
Of course. Yeah. So that's a great question, because a lot of people ask me that, like, how do you know the things that you talk about?
Yeah,
and so
exactly.
Everyone finds their pathway to truth differently, but my system, or my framework, how I use, is it's kind of 4 points, and it's kind of like a diamond. And so at the bottom is history, right? Historical accounts. And then it goes up to scripture or religious writings. And then it also has lore, right? So like legend and cultural folklore and tales. And then the top is my intuitive understanding or channel. And so when all 4 of those line up for me, that's what I consider truth, or that's what I consider my version of what I consider true and authentic, or an accurate account of something. And so when it comes to the story of Joseph leaving on a boat from the Levant, from the Holy Land, and going on this journey or pilgrimage through France to ancient Britain, there are a number of contemporary historical accounts that talk about this, as well as it being validated later in history. And I'd say the one that I put the most amount of weight on actually comes from Rome itself. And so there was a cardinal who was named Cardinal Baronius, who was pretty much the most legendary Vatican librarian that ever existed. And so if anyone had an agenda to change the story or wield a story in Rome's favor, Cardinal Baronius would have absolutely been someone who would want to have told a version or recount a version that supported Rome's supremacy claim in the church. But even he himself says that Joseph of Arimathea, with the people that were with him on a boat, left the Holy Land and then went to France, and from France that party went into ancient Britain. So even Rome itself is, and through Cardinal Baronius's account as a Vatican librarian, even he attests to this fact, because that's the first kind of stepping point that people get divided on, is that the story of where Mary Magdalene went after the crucifixion. And there's kind of like 2 camps of people. There's the people that say she went to France and only France. And then there's the people that say she ended up in ancient Britain. And I mean, that's a whole area that is very important to historically and factually open up and explore. But in the end, everyone's going to find the truth. It depends what you feel is true and what everyone feels is true. And so I always invite people, go to the places where these events took place and see what you feel, whether you go to France or you go to England or you go to both, and you get to receive from the land and the stories. But at least when it comes to the historical accounts, it's very clear that even if they stopped in France, which I believe they did, they all ended up in ancient Britain, because the lore, even in ancient Britain, talks about Mary Magdalene being there, which is very fascinating to see. And they do it centuries before there was any reference of Mary Magdalene being in France. But I think the most important part of this story is the idea of the Grail, right? What
Mm.
does the Grail mean? What does it represent? Is it a cup? Is it an object? Is it a deeper teaching to the feminine, to the Sophianic Christ, to Mary Magdalene? Maybe all of the above. But everything is very clearly stated that Joseph and the Grail returned back to ancient Britain. And so that in itself, I think, is very important. And then what you find is, in the first century in ancient Wales, where the Grail first returned, the first foundations of the oldest church, the oldest above ground church anywhere in the world, even predating Glastonbury Abbey, was in Wales. And so there's such a history there. And again, there's a lot of my work is dedicated to unpacking that story. So much of that represents the founding, right, of the first wave of Christ to light outside the Holy Land, and the history, the religious writings of the time, as well as all the lore and the legend and the cultural tales that are told, all attest to that fact here. And then you get to see, okay, so what happens then? How does the light become anchored in these lands? How does it spread? And that's the story of the Celtic Church, or the Coldy Church, or really what my next course I'm launching, The Golden Women, tells the story of how it became anchored and how it would spread. And what I find really fascinating, just on a side note, talking about Rudolf Steiner, who I love Steiner. I'm
Mm.
sure you're familiar with Steiner.
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so he
Yeah. I love.
talk about a man that's like doing a little bit of everything, like a true mystic and genius. Even in his writings, he said something very fascinating. He said the second of coming of the Christ is going to be connected to the lands of ancient Britain. And so he said that a long time before a lot of this history was even well known or well
Oh wow.
documented. And so that there's a lot of mystics and seers, which, whether we accept them or not, but there's a lot of also historical accounts and lore that are on these lands that all attest to something very similar. And this is one of the reasons why Rome invaded the UK for the second time, right? So there's two invasions of
Ah.
Rome into ancient Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And the second time them invading, coincidentally, happens to be right after this church was being anchored in these lands. So there's so much there. There's such a rich history and a story there. And all of what I'm talking about, which is so interesting, can actually be historically found. Like, you just need to do the deep dives into piecing these stories together. So when I talk about a lot of these things, people are like, well, how could you, like, is this channeled work? And it's like, no, it's all
Yeah.
historically grounded, but it's all puzzle pieces scattered about in many places. And I've had to spend, the last 5 years gathering these puzzle pieces together into a coherent story, because the story, it's there. It takes a lot of work for people to get back into it. And then when you realize all the different historical sources, you're like, wow, how is this not even more widespread? And that's a question I'm not fully sure either. But then, even when we look at the histories of the council meetings of the Roman kind of Christian Empire, all throughout the centuries, we see that for the kind of the first 1,000 years, there are many different council meetings that kind of Rome would organize, and religious leaders would gather from different parts of the Roman Christian kingdom. And they would debate on different things and talk about different things. And we actually have kind of like the records of all these kind of meetings, or at least what they talked about and what they debated on and agreed upon. And in every council meeting, one of the main things that they would debate is the prime church, right? The primacy church, the church that came first. And every country, well, there's Rome, right? You had France in there, you had Spain in there, you had ancient Britain in there. they would all, like, essentially it's like being in a courtroom. You would lay your case down, you would put your case down, and you would say, okay, here's my facts, here's why I think I'm the first church. And they of course all felt they should be the first church, but in every council meeting it was always affirmed that ancient Britain was the oldest church, the ancient British church was the prime church. So even Rome's own records attest to this fact too. So it's just so fascinating to know this is a lost aspect of history, and it's a piece of the puzzle that absolutely needs to be told.
Wow. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you for your devotion, and I just love the scholar and the historian in you, you know. It's because one thing is to channel these things, you know, how many people in the more new age kind of community, there's so many people connecting with Mary Magdalene, but there's also a lot of, you know, like distortion around that I've been encountering, where I'm like, this doesn't feel true, you know, and oftentimes it's very just like, oh, it's just what I'm feeling, and I'm channeling Mary Magdalene, or I'm channeling this or that. But what I love, what you bring here, is you do the actual research, right? You're using your brain, your intellect, and you're excavating, and you're probably sitting like a mad scientist at home trying to figure out these puzzle pieces, and that is so important. Yeah. So
Thank you for saying
thanks on
that.
this. Yeah, on this
It,
note.
it's to me, the one of the most important things we can do is to marry our critical faculties of the mind with our spirit or our heart. Like, it's that bridge between the two. And you're right. When it comes to Mary Magdalene, she is a fascinating figure because of the almost infinite interpretations that are out there about her. And as someone who leads kind of Christian oriented retreats, especially here in ancient Britain, I can't tell you how many people have come on retreat and started saying, like, this is the truth of Mary Magdalene, and this is right, the facts and this her story. And I love receiving everyone's transmission about her, because it's great that people are talking about her. And then I'll just ask questions. I'll be like, so where do you know this from, or where does this come from? And almost
Mm,
always it's because they know, right, or they've channeled it, that type of energy. And there's nothing wrong with channeling. I mean, I certainly use my intuitive abilities to find my truths as well. But if you're only doing a channeling, right, if it's just coming from spirit or a spiritual source, it has no foundation, right? And so it's like, it's kind of like it's just flowing through the air. And how can it be accepted for truth if it's not being grounded on something? And just the same, going to the other polarity, people who are only doing these journeys through fact or research or historical accounts, or the people say, if only if it's in the Bible is it true, right? And if it's not there, then it's untrue. If you're
yeah.
only doing your truth finding missions on history and contemporary sources, or the Bible, even, for instance, you're missing the point, because you're missing spirit, right? You're missing that deeper connection that transcends just historical accounts. So you have to bring them together. You have to marry them together. And that's, again, why I find, like, my kind of diamond configuration of history, scripture, lore, and intuitive thing is that they need, for me anyways, if something is true, it needs to resonate on both levels. It needs to both feel
Yeah.
intuitively true as well as historically and scripturally true. And that's when, like, if something hits those, really checks those boxes, then I'm like, oh, that's more likely to be true than something that's just channeled or something that's just historically documented.
Mm. And bringing up, to really underline this, the first and highest commandment of Jesus is love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind,
Yes.
right?
It's
Also
the
the
mind.
mind. Like,
Yeah.
often people exclude the mind, and it's all about the heart. Yes, it is. It's all about the soul. Yes, it is. But it's also about the mind. You know, it's a beautiful tool. So I love what you're bringing here. Yeah.
It's important. That's why I love reading the Gospel of Thomas. Like, it's because Thomas was so focused on cultivating the power of our discerning mind, and really
Mm,
seeing how, when we wield our creative intellectual faculties, really, it's in service of the divine. And we need that to cultivate our discernment, right? To truly wield the sword that Jesus was talking about, is to cultivate our ability to discern truth from untruth. And it requires the mind to do that as well. It absolutely does. And so the Gospel of Thomas and many of these apocryphal Gospels, they're more written almost like riddles. Like they're written in a way that actually takes us mentally to solve the puzzle, because it's teaching us how the mind can unlock the unknowable or ineffable divine God if we allow our mind to be married with our heart, or our spirits for that matter.
Yeah. Oh, I love the Gospel of Thomas. I just started diving deeper into it, and yeah, very resonant. So how do you feel at the moment? Do you still have, like, time, and like, do you feel like diving into something different, because we are
Of
approaching
course. Yeah, let's do
over an
it.
hour? Yeah, awesome. So yeah, I have two more topics that I would love to explore. What's your relationship to Christ, Yeshua, Jesus? Like, how would you, on an experiential, embodied level, how would you, describe it? I'm super curious how people relate to Jesus, in their
Mm-hmm.
own way.
Yeah, he is the most luminous bro I've ever met. Like really, really, truly, like because so much of my work into Christianity and really the story of Joseph Arimathea started by trying to understand who Jesus was as a man, right? Because we see him in the Bible as a divine figure, as the form of God, the
Mm.
Son. And when we read the Bible, it's kind of like, well, he's this very special baby, and then 30 or so years later, he shows up on the scene as God. Like, well, what happened? Like, what took place between there? Because obviously there was, decades of life in there, and decades of
Yeah.
experiences in there. And what happened? Like, was he always just this divine being, or did he learn to become this divine being? Did he cultivate his capacity to hold divine light in his form? I just became obsessed with him as the man, not just the divine being. And so that put me on a quest to study what's known as the lost years of Jesus, right? The part of Jesus's life that the Bible is silent about. And even though it's not talked about in the traditional Bible, what we do have, again, is a lot of alternative sources, apocryphal sources, lore and legend sources that all should be explored and connected with. And it would speak essentially, like, to sum them all up, is this man who cultivated the capacity for God to dwell within, right? And to embody it so much that he was that. And not just because only he could do that. When you start going down these alternative streams, it wasn't that just he could do that, everybody could do that. And he was a messenger and an example and a way shower for everyone to cultivate the power of Christ within themselves. Even in the Bible, it's that, what he does, we will do even more so, right? That's the idea that he will embrace us so that we can become the Christ as well. And he wouldn't talk about that if it wasn't true, right? He wouldn't say these things if it wasn't a concept that bore truth and led to truth being born and bloomed through us. And so I feel my relationship to Jesus really is a relationship of remembrance, where he's like, look, I did this, and you can do this too if you want to do this. And you won't be punished because you won't do it. But if you want the highest gold that can ever be found in creation, go on this path and cultivate your Christed light, because then you embody the flame, and then your flame will help ignite and help others remember too. So it's this continual propagation of this Christed flame. He and Mary Magdalene were some of the brightest flames that ever existed. And so when I feel Yeshua, and in many ways, many of the great holy, luminous men that I carry in my heart, they're all doing the same thing, which is reminding, both for me, but also for everyone. It's like, you can do this too. You can have this too. You can be in this state too, if you want to be. They did it to show us it was possible. And now it's up to us to walk that path if we want to. And we even see that within the I am teachings of Jesus, because the I am statements that Jesus made are really beautiful and really powerful. And to me, they hold their greatest coding when you read them and receive them in Aramaic, because when you have the term I am written in Aramaic, essentially when you see it in Aramaic, it's ina, which ina is the kind of like the letter I. So you have I. So when Jesus is speaking these I am statements, most people think he's just talking about himself. Like, I am this, I am that, me. It's all about me. But when you read the I am statements in Aramaic, ina, or I kind of means the I that's behind the I, or the you that's behind you, right? The being that dwells within you is the way and the light. So even the statements of Jesus's I am, right? These I am statements were never about us focusing on him and only him. It's really this true teachings of it, or in my opinion, the more accurate teachings of it, are saying like the being that dwells within you is the way. Connect to that being. That's the light. Connect to that being. So his teachings really were about empowering us, making sure we don't lose our power and that we retain that divine connection. And so that's how I feel Jesus still illuminates things in me, by helping me remember my own inherent divinity, my own Christed potential, and to make sure that my power is always anchored in a sovereign way within my own heart.
Mm. Oh, so fascinating to hear about how you relate to Christ. It's one of my favorite and most fascinating Bible passages when Jesus says, what I did or what I do, you can do as well, and you
And
will do
even
it
more so, yeah.
even more so, right?
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with this. And it's not like from my own interpretation. It's not to say that I, as like Felix, or you as Oliver, are doing this. It's more like, as we cultivate the Christ within, Christ is actually doing it through us. It's not I, but Christ who lives in me, the Galatians quote. Yeah,
Exactly. Well,
that's
that's
what
the
I
secret,
feel.
is that you have to separate Jesus from Christ, right? They are one, but they're not fully, if that makes sense, is that there's a difference between trying to connect with Jesus and connecting with the Christ, and seeing, okay, what's the nuance in there? What's that relationship in there? And what does it mean to me? And I think that's why even you see it in religious writings, there's actually a difference between when Yeshua is mentioned versus the Christ is mentioned, and they don't always mean the same thing. So it's so interesting to reframe that for some people and be like, okay, well, what does it mean for myself to be open to allow the Christ to work through me? Is it Jesus just working through me, or is it the Christed spirit, consciousness, essence, light that is then moving through me? And perhaps this is what Jesus was trying to help us remember, is that he is someone who was open to the Christ moving through him, being in that relationship with Christ. And we can be that, or we can have that, or we can at very least cultivate that as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm still wrestling with that in
Mm-hmm.
myself to some degree. Because it's very controversial to what, Catholicism, for example, teaches us, where it's like Jesus is the living Son of God. And like when you were saying, like separating Yeshua and Jesus from the Christ, I think that would upset a lot of religious people. But I'm still, sort of wrestling with that myself. But it's
We all
definitely an
are. Yeah, we
interesting,
all are.
yeah, yeah, an interesting aspect to sit with. How can we bring Christ into this world? How can we cultivate the Christ within us? That reminds me of something that Meister Eckhart, my favorite mystic, said. He talks about the birth of the Word of God in the soul. So
Mm.
the birth of Christ in the soul. And he adds, what good, I'm paraphrasing here, by the way, what good is it that Maria, some 1400 years ago, birthed the Christ if I do not birth it myself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Him, myself, yeah. Like, we are all being called forward to receive God in the sense of like bridal mysticism, right? Right? Like we are receiving God, and the soul is like the feminine aspect. God is seeding himself in us, and we are
Mm-hmm.
birthing the word of God into this world. That's
Absolutely.
what I personally resonate with
Yeah,
deeply.
it's beautiful. I love that. I mean, that so much of what the Pentecost was about was exactly that, and this idea that we need to be rebirthed in the image of God always and continually, being not only birthing the Word of God through us, but being rebirthed in the presence
Oh yeah.
of God and the divine, or the Christ, to be born. I mean, this gets to the heart of what it means to be born again, right? It's like, to be born again, you have to be birthed again, right? So what is that process? What does it represent to us? And how do we allow ourselves to be rebirthed, or to receive the Holy Spirit? Or in Aramaic, what's fascinating is the word ruka, means both
Yes.
spirit and breath, right? So you have Holy
Mm-hmm.
Spirit, holy breath. And this is one of my favorite, parts of when Jesus, there's so much emphasis on this breath, this idea of breath, what breath represents, but also how come Jesus is breathing on people, right? There's so many biblical references of Jesus breathing on people. And you get into it, and the nuances, he's not really breathing on anyone, he's breathing you. And then you take that one step deeper or further away, and you see it's the Holy Spirit breathing us, or God breathing us, and allowing ourselves that not only are we breathing the Holy Spirit ourselves, but the Holy Spirit is breathing us. God is breathing us. And so we are that vessel, we are that conduit that, in order to be in a relationship with the father or mother, or however we want to describe it, it's like we have to be open enough to see is that we are both an agent or a vessel that is birthing the word of God or the spirit of God into the world, but we are also being birthed through that very same spirit, or
Yeah.
that very
Yeah.
same. So it's such a, like, again, Thomas and Philip again are so beautiful to explore. This is that's paradox. It's all built also in the paradox. How do we become God while also allowing God to move through us? And that to me is really what Jesus was so beautifully an example of. He was both of God and allowed God to be birthed even more so in the world through him.
Mm, yeah. How do we name the ineffable?
Yeah, that's the fun part.
Oh, yeah. Oh man. Okay. Final topic I would like to dive into with you is practical ways, really grounding it down for all the people who are listening and who are really interested to sort of dive deeper into the topics that we explored. What would be some practical ways, maybe books, maybe some exercises, just what comes to you? What would you suggest people to really deepen what we in what we just talked about together?
Oh, that's the fun part, is that there's infinite ways out there to God, right? It's kind of like climbing up a mountain. God's at the top, but there's so many different pathways we can take to the divine, to get up there. And for me, what I love recreating as a way of my kind of continual refreshing of connection to God is spending time in nature, like absolutely spending time in nature. And we see that with the kind of Celtic Christian traditions is men and women who felt the presence of God would realize, I need to go out into the woods and cultivate this presence, right? They would create these things called hermitages, which are basically sacred sites in woodlands or nature somewhere. And why I think it's so important for people to reconnect with nature now is it does two things. One, it plugs us back into the kind of Gaian consciousness, or the earth mother consciousness, or, we're all children of the earth. And so it helps return us in a state of connection to the divine mother in many ways, and heal that aspect. Especially, I think a lot of us men are going through healing collective mother wounds. Not that each of us might have had a traumatic childhood or relationship with our mother, but we all in one way or another are experiencing a collective mother wound or an earth mother wound. And so for me as a man, spending time in nature really helps heal that, and realize how fundamentally we are all connected through the kind of natural world. But at the same time, spending time in nature, I think, also resets our energetic field. It clears away a
Yeah,
lot of distractions. It clears away a lot of, EMF pollution from the modern world, whatever you want to call it. But it returns us into a state of purity. Like all the Celtic Christian hermits and mystics would talk about that. By like spending time in nature, you actually meet the Father even more. And the reason for that is because it helps create a pure and undistracted field. And not that you have to, go out into the woods and live there forever, but just even spending, small amounts of time in your day in nature gives you that chance of getting back into quiet contemplation. Because through quiet contemplation, that's where we can hear the voice of God ever more clearly. And so that's, I think, my biggest advice to people is go out into nature, because it's going to heal so many aspects of who and what we are, while at the same time helping us connect even more to the divine. And we see that in a lot of the teachings, even about Mary Magdalene on the Celtic Isles, is that she oftentimes is called in ancient traditions Mari Coed, which means Mary of the woods or Mary of the forest. Not that she was just this Maria Mary in the woods, although she was that too. It's remembering that in order for us to meet God the Father more, we have to meet God the Mother. And to meet God the Mother more, we have to meet God the Father more. So it's like this beautiful paradox that happens in nature. So my ultimate advice is, do all the things you feel drawn to do, of course, but there's something magical, I think, strangely enough, paradoxically enough, and by connecting to the Christ, we find the Christ really clearly in nature.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love how clear you are, and you just go back to nature, people. It's really that, yeah.
That's my two fundamental parts about life. Is I feel like one is always go back to nature. Your life will always be better if you spend time in nature. And people always ask me like, what does Christianity mean to you? And I'm like, it kind of just, you can sum it up in two parts: be good and do good. That's it. Like for me, that's all of Christianity is. It could just be summed up so beautifully like that. It's just be good and do good. Be a good person and do good things. That's it. And it doesn't even need to be any more complicated than that.
I love that. Right there with you. We can have the most in-depth theological discussions and stuff, but does it really lead us closer to the original essential teachings of Jesus? Be good, do good, love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and mind, and just, be a good person. Yeah. Thank you. We are approaching the end. Landing the airplane we've been on. Anything that you'd like to share, sort of as a last thought? Anything that wants to come through?
I would say, just because it's one of my favorite phrases in Aramaic, which is the Aramaic term for kingdom of heaven, which is Malkuta Dashmaya. Malkuta Dashmaya. And so when you open that word up, Malkuta, which is the word for kingdom, which is funny enough, it's a feminine word. So some people like to, translate it as queendom, which you could do, but it doesn't necessarily mean like man and woman. When a word is feminine, it stops it from being a noun, or in this instance, a place, but more of an experience or vibration of. So kingdom, Malkuta Dashmaya, at least as it was originally spoken in Aramaic, kingdom doesn't mean an actual place, like a geographic place on earth or, somewhere in the divine clouds. Malkuta represents a state of being or vibrational state of being. And then Shemaya, which is heaven, right? And so when you say Malkuta Dashmaya, it means kingdom of heaven. When we're talking about how important it is for the kingdom to return and for the realms of heaven to be manifest on earth, it's not about going somewhere else, right? The kingdom of heaven is not a journey or a destination that we're going to this kingdom of heaven. It's about learning to become the vibration of the kingdom of heaven, or the embodied state of heaven. And by embodying that state and becoming that vibration, that is actually what unlocks the kingdom of heaven on earth. So even just this term kingdom of heaven, it's not a place. It is a state of being. And so if we want heaven to return, that's what's important to us, is that we become that vibration and that state. And the paradox is real. By becoming it, we open it and we anchor it into earth. So it's my deep hope that for all of us to make our journey to the kingdom of heaven by realizing that it's no journey at all. It's all inside. The kingdom is within you, and become that vibration, and we'll anchor. Then it comes down, right? New Jerusalem, the kingdom of heaven come down through us.
Thank you. I love that. Yeah. Oliver, where can people find you? I know you have a lot of, on Instagram, different avenues, different branches of your work. You have your elven jewelry, your retreats, your more historian-based teaching work. Tell us a little bit about that, lastly.
Yeah, I would say definitely check out Instagram's a great place for where I put a lot of it out there, which you can find at the Gnostic Druid. So Gnostic is spelled Gnostic. So the Gnostic Druid. So it's my work kind of both with the Christed mysteries as well as kind of the Druidic mysteries. And then on my website, thegnosticdruid.com, I have lots of courses which you can take exploring, Aramaic, the Christed mysteries, the story of the Celtic Magdalene, all sorts of really fun and interesting dives, which you can just essentially purchase, and then you can do them yourself. Like most of the courses have already been done. And then I have some new courses you can take live coming up, which is fun. And also the retreats that I lead. So I lead retreats all over Britain. So exploring mainly Wales and England and the ancient stories of Christianity there. So if you're someone who not only likes to learn about this stuff, but actually come on physical pilgrimages, which I actually think is really important for people to do. I also lead retreats throughout the year, exploring these type of mysteries and helping people connect, with the spirit of the land and really the Christ memories that are woven into these lands.
Gorgeous. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay, thank you so much, Oliver. That's the end of today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed it just as much as Oliver and I did. And yeah, it's an honor to have you here. I really appreciate you tuning in, listening, learning, and walking this mystical path alongside us. As always, you know how it goes. If you're listening or watching on YouTube, I would highly appreciate if you comment, like, and leave a subscription. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcast, I'd love for a 5-star rating. I'd really appreciate that if you enjoyed the episode, of course. And having said this, yeah, have a good one. Bye-bye.